How's it going, good people? My name's Pedro, and today we're going to be looking at a bunch of different storage options, from hard drives all the way up to M.2 SSDs, to ultimately understand what is the best value for money when it comes to picking up a new drive in real-world performance. Along with that as well, we'll be looking and breaking down a bunch of the different specs on different hard drives to ultimately understand what is a bunch of marketing mumbo-jumbo that honestly we should all just forget about and not even pay attention to. And now, I know it's definitely coming into the holiday season, so there'll be a bunch of sales going on leading up to Christmas and New Year. So ideally this would be a great Christmas present to get someone, whether it would be a friend, a family member, a loved one, or even yourself. 2020 has been a hard enough year, so I think everyone deserves to treat themselves just a little bit. Now, when it comes to picking up SSDs, we're going to be having a look at three main different drives. We're going to be looking at a Seagate Barracuda hard drive. We're also going to look at a Samsung 860 Pro Evo drive. So this is a SATA-based SSD drive. And then finally, we're going to be looking at a little tiny SSD. This is the ADATA XP280. This is a small M.2 NVMe based SSD. This has a lot of punch for such a small and tiny drive, and in all honesty, it is about the size of a stick of gum. Now, let's talk a little bit about effectively what these different hard drive technologies are to ultimately get a solid understanding of basically what we're getting into when we purchase one of these drives. So let's start off with the oldest of the bunch. This is the initial mechanical drive. So a mechanical drive basically works by a spinning platter that basically has a needle to read and write memory to and from. This is one of the oldest ways of actually reading from a drive itself. It provides a lot of capacity, but unfortunately has a bit of a letdown when it comes to speed itself. Moving on from that, you have SATA-based SSDs, which use a lot of the groundwork that was set up by mechanical drives, such as the communication protocol, but instead of having physical moving parts, this uses NAND storage, which is effectively a bunch of logic gates to store data and ultimately be a lot faster than a mechanical drive. This is mostly because there are no moving parts in the drive at all, and because it's logic driven rather than mechanically driven, it is more reliable and then in turn faster as well. Now, moving on to the final drive. This is the M.2 NVMe drive. This is another leap forward from the SATA-based SSDs. Gone are the old cables, and gone is the physical mount for the drive itself. The M.2 drives all in fact sit on your motherboard itself and effectively become a part of the actual mainboard for your computer itself. But the benefit with this is that they are a lot faster, they end up taking a lot less space, and they have the same, if not more capacity than their older SATA-based SSD counterparts. Okay, so now we understand a little bit more about how these drives work on an architecture perspective. So now let's jump into the actual specifications on the drive itself. So that way when we look at the real world performance, we can understand whether or not these specifications are a solid indicator into real world performance. So now the mechanical spinning drive itself, Seagate has a 140 megabytes per second read-write speed on the box itself. So this means that when you are using the drive in day-to-day use, you should be looking at about 140 megabytes per second when reading from the disk or writing to it. On the Samsung itself, you have a 560 read and a 530 write speed on that. This is significantly faster going to the Samsung SSD, so we are expecting a solid 2 to at least 4x improvement going from the mechanical drive through to the SSD using a SATA cable. So now finally moving into the M.2 drive, this has 3,500 megabytes per second read and write speed. Now this is 6 to 7 times better than the Samsung SSD. So the comparison from the Samsung SSD to the M.2, at least my expectations of it, is that this should be a night and day difference. There should be a noticeable difference going from a SATA-based SSD through to an M.2 SSD. at least based on the read-write speeds that we are being told by the manufacturers alone. Alrighty, so now let's go ahead and jump into the testing methodology for the actual hard drives themselves. So the testing on these drives actually took a fair bit of time from my end out here, because I wanted to get a comprehensive test on all of these drives to ultimately understand not just the physical numbers, but actually know what it feels like to use this on a day-to-day basis. So in fact, I ended up switching all of my workflows out to a couple of days on each of these individual drives. So initially I used the hard drive for a bit to do everything from day-to-day work all the way out to sort of gaming, video editing, and just watching and consuming content in general of these individual drives. So the tests that were run specifically on all of these drives was initially a 10 gigabyte file transfer so that you can judge on a burst use how efficient these drives are at moving data from point A to point B. On top of that, I've also thrown in a bunch of different game tests, and I'll give my overall thoughts after each individual results and looking at all of the comparisons of these drives to ultimately understand basically how it felt to use each individual drives and give my honest opinions after that. So now the first actual test we're doing on all of these drives themselves is a quick Crystal Disk Mark checkup to ultimately understand basically, are these drives operating at a speed that is at least close to what's advertised in all of the specifications that we see on all of the boxes. And I'm actually pretty glad to say that Crystal Disk Mark does manage to confirm all of the drive speeds themselves. Sure, the speed is a little lower than what's expected, but we're not gonna get a perfect scenario like they do when running these drives, and we don't get the chance to cherry pick the best sort of runs to put on our boxes themselves. This is a more realistic day-to-day use of what we can expect out of these drives themselves, which all in all, I'm pretty happy about that. At least what they're putting on the box is somewhat realistic. So now jumping into the actual functional tests themselves, the first sort of core functional check I wanted to run was having a look at the copy speeds moving from an external drive through to these internal hard drives themselves here. And it was a very interesting batch to have a look at when it came to the actual results themselves there. My initial expectations, like I said before, is that the hard drive would come in at the bottom of the stack, and there would be a massive difference from the hard drive to the SSDs, and from the SSD to the M.2 drive would be an even bigger difference as well. We would be expecting almost near instance transfer speeds when it would come up to that fabled 3,500 megabytes per second. So looking at the hard drive speeds out here, it's a little surprising to see transferring from an external drive to a hard disk drive took almost about 10 minutes. So it was about 8 minutes and 50 seconds in total, which is not really that big of a difference when you look at that compared out to the SATA-based SSD, which came in at just over the 7-minute mark, which is pretty impressive all in all. Managing to go from a physical mechanical drive through to the solid state storage managed to shave off about a minute and a half, which is something that is definitely good to note and definitely good to see in these drive comparisons. Also, along with that, moving from the SATA-based SSD out to the NVMe drive didn't really seem to yield that much of a difference. All in all, shaving off about 30 seconds on average, which really isn't that much of a difference when you compare it out to the specifications themselves. We were expecting a massive 7x performance in comparison to the SATA-based SSDs. Now, I think this is also transferred over when we look at some of the game launch times and game responsiveness. So when we look at things like Overwatch for things like load times and loading into the game itself, on average, we can see that it takes about 25 seconds for the SATA-based SSDs. The slower hard drives come in at nearly double the speed out there at 45 seconds. And then we can see the NVMe drive actually pulls out a solid lead out here, coming in at just up over 15 seconds, which is actually fairly noticeable. It's almost like you click it and you pretty much take a moment and then you're into the game straight away. Now, Overwatch definitely had sort of the biggest sort of delta between the drives themselves. Having a look at Rainbow Six Siege was the next sort of title we're going to look at the comparisons for. Rainbow Six Siege on the hard drive itself took nearly 2 minutes to load into the screen. And one thing to note out here, loading into Rainbow Six, even after getting into the game itself, there was still a fair bit of sort of stuttering and lagging when it came to the actual functionality of the game itself. I think you could definitely interact with the menus and use the game as intended, but it definitely hadn't fully loaded everything in the background itself. Looking at the SATA-based SSDs, you can see that it's a similar story to what we see before. There's a significant improvement going from a hard disk drive to the SATA-based SSDs, but not really so much when you look at that in comparison to the NVMe drive. You're only managing to shave off about 10 seconds here. And now finally, looking at Borderlands 3, which is another game to have notoriously long load times, we can see that it is not really that much of a difference going from a SATA-based drive through to the NVMe. At the bottom of the rung, you see the hard drive that comes in at over 2 minutes. Then you have the SATA-based SSD coming in at just under 1.5 minutes. And then at the 1 minute 20 mark, you basically see the NVMe SSD drive as well, which is kind of surprising because once again, the expectation out here was that it would be a significantly faster experience seeing the actual NVMe SSD drive compared to the SATA-based drive. From the specs alone, we're effectively expecting this drive to perform a lot better than it actually did. Now, I'm sure that this is pretty much as expected when it comes to the actual performance of the drive itself. I'm sure there are a bunch of other things that weigh into the drive itself, and I guess this is one of the instances where basically getting an M.2 drive might not necessarily yield a lot better performance all in all when compared to other sort of drives as well. In all honesty, from the price difference looking at the NVMe drive through to the SATA-based SSDs, I think it was almost negligible, and you'd be saving a lot more looking at a SATA-based SSDs rather than looking at an M.2 drive. Sure, it's nice to have everything sort of mounted to your motherboard, especially on like a small form factor build, but the price you're actually paying to get something that you're not really going to see after it's installed in your computer, I don't know. I really can't recommend that all in all. If it was me and I had the option of picking up just one of these drives, I honestly would just spring for like a solid 2 terabyte version of the Samsung drive, because honestly, you're not really losing out on that much performance all in all. You're still managing to maintain a great amount of physical performance on the drive itself. And all in all, it's not really that big that it's actually taking up a lot of space in your case. In fact, a lot of PCs already have a dedicated mount for some sort of drive or the other. And all in all, you're managing to save a fair bit in terms of money all in all, because these Samsung drives have been out for a while now, and no one's really going to have that much of an issue sort of picking one up altogether. But essentially, that was my thoughts on it all in all. Let me know down in the comments if you've got an SSD in your computer as well. I'd love to know what your thoughts are, whether or not you'd even recommend picking up an SSD these days, or should you just say team hard drive, maybe never turn your computer off and just leave whatever game you play just open 24/7. Either way, I'd love to hear from you all down in the comments. My name's been Pedro. Until I talk to you guys next time, I hope you all have a good one. Take it easy.